Hey everybody, Charley Hogwood with Survival Dispatch back here again for another of our Lessons Learned series of videos. This time around, we're going to touch base on generators. Yep, generators, making your own power. One of the top 9 areas of preparedness that I always talk about, and one of the things that I say that is probably easiest to live without, unless you have something that you really need to use electricity for. So generators are a special kind of a piece of equipment sometimes, different sizes, different fuels, different applications, and it helps to get the right kind and to size it and to use it and know what your strategy is for going forward with that so that you can optimize that piece of equipment in your long-term needs for off-grid survival. So off-grid survival includes hurricane outages, regular power outages, all of those things that would cause the power to be off when you need electricity. And why do you need electricity? You need to keep your food cold. You need to keep your food frozen. You need to keep maybe some air moving. Maybe you have some medical equipment that you need to keep power to. All of that kind of stuff. If you got a CPAP machine that you use, if you got an oxygen nebulizer, things like that all require power. Some of the other stuff you can get by on batteries, like radios and AM radios, things of that nature that you can stock little batteries for. That's fine. But there are some larger things that really would benefit from the use of owning a generator. Now, you may say, what kind of generator do I need? How big do I need? Well, what we're going to do is we're going to go through a little bit of that to help your decision-making process. And even if you already have a generator, we're going to talk about the strategies of how to use those and prepare them so that you don't run short on fuel and supplies. So let's talk a little bit about the differences between fuel choices. Now, there are multiple choices of fuel. Propane and gasoline are the two common. Gasoline is, of course, the most common portable generator that you're going to see on the market. Propane is another one. You can do a propane conversion to pretty much any gasoline operated generator. All you got to do is get a propane conversion kit, and I'll tell you about the benefits of those. The other kind of fuel that you might see on generators might be diesel. Now, diesel fuel, that usually runs on larger generators. That's a little bit different. Since it's not that common, I'm not going to dig into it all that much. We're going to focus on the fuel choices between propane and gasoline. So the pros and cons. Let's talk about gasoline a little bit. Gasoline's got a limited shelf life. We know that. We need stabilizers for that fuel. If it sits around, it can get moisture in the cans, right? If you get moisture in the cans, that moisture is going to end up in your carburetor. It's going to get through there and it's going to start causing you operating problems. So we don't like moisture in our fuel. Ethanol that is in most of today's fuels has a tendency to corrode systems. The problem with running ethanol through small engines and then letting it sit for a while is it separates, and it also creates moisture. That alcohol that's in the ethanol will start to condensate, and that will corrode the inside of your fuel system. It can damage the rubber seals and O-rings and seats of valve systems, and that's not going to help you when you need to use that piece of equipment. A lot of boat engines have problems with that because they don't get used very often. Ethanol separates in the cans and it tears up your fuel systems on boat engines. Well, generators are not that much different as being small internal combustion engines. So if you're lucky, you can find non-ethanol gasoline, and that's a good thing to store if you can get that. Gasoline is also very easy to find except in an emergency. So for anybody that's experienced a hurricane before or a disaster that is ongoing and the fuel trucks can't get to the fuel stations, you'll see the long lines of people standing there with little red cans trying to fill up those cans. One of the little tips and tricks that you might see is sometimes a gas pump might say diesel, or it might say emergency use only, or it might just say it's empty. It's not really empty. It may be. They might have put the bag on the handle, but sometimes those bags are just put there so people won't think to use that pump because they want to save that for police cars and government vehicles. So just because a pump says it's empty does not necessarily mean it is empty. Dangerous for refueling on hot engines. If anybody's ever refueled a gas lawnmower and got a little bit of fuel on that hot muffler, you can get a combustion, and out in the daylight, in the sunlight, you won't see that flame necessarily. It's not the fluid of the gasoline that burns, it is the vapor that comes off the gasoline that burns, and it burns very quickly. So a little firefighting tip for you, nothing actually burns. It's the vapors off the things that burn. If this table being made out of wood were to catch on fire, the wood is not technically what's burning. the heat has created a condition where it releases the gases off of the wood that is burning, and now it's reducing that wood into to a fuel. So that's the same thing that happens with gasoline. So it's very dangerous to pour gasoline on hot engines. I've seen people do it. I've seen fires break out from that. So if you're going to use a generator and you're going to refill it with gasoline, you need to let that sit for a while and cool down. Because everybody here, I'm sure, has experienced refilling a lawnmower, and you fill it up and you can't see how much is in there, and it all gurgles out all over the side of the engine. You don't want to do that when you're standing over it. You don't want to do that when it's near your garage or near your house somewhere, under your deck, where it's going to catch the house on fire. So let those engines cool down a little bit. So let's talk about propane. Propane, does it have any of those same problems? Well, LP gas lasts absolutely forever. It's always been there. It doesn't need much to be converted into a use of fuel. They only add an odorant, which is called ethyl mercaptan, which is, I believe, the stinkiest substance on the planet, according to the Guinness Book, if I'm not mistaken. And they take about 1 Dixie cup full of that stuff to put into each 9,000 gallon semi-tanker to give it the odorant that you normally smell in natural or propane gas. So over time, that odorant can work its way out, and in very, very old fuel, you cannot smell it. If you have an old propane tank that's been sitting around for many years, that's been filled a lot of times, the larger ones that are alongside the house, sometimes all that odorant can sit down and build into an oil in the bottom of those tanks. And as they get low on fuel level, now that concentration of that odorant comes out more, and you'll smell it more, and you'll actually think you have a gas leak. So that's just a little insider tip on what happens when old propane tanks have been used for many years get that increased saturation of ethyl mercaptan in them. But propane itself will always be flammable. As long as there's pressure to it, it can be used. I've pulled propane tanks out of the ground that have been there for 40, 50, 60 years, and the gas in there was perfectly fine, and we've run it through equipment to burn it off. So you can actually bury a propane tank as long as it's got the proper cathodic protection, anti-corrosion protection. So you can bury those under the ground, which makes them very good for long-term or grid down situations, because that gas is now underground in a heavy tank, and it's prepared properly for long-term storage. Now, if you live anywhere near a salty area like a coastal area, or there's a lot of groundwater, make sure that tank is coated with what's called a cathodic protection paint, and then you put on a sacrificial anode on there, and that's kind of like on a boat where you have the zincs on a boat engine. Well, that sacrificial anode will start to eat away, and it'll draw that electrolysis off the tank. That's what makes buried propane tanks such a great idea for long-term storage. And those buried tanks are out of sight, out of mind, and people don't know they're there, and they're not going to run off with them. So that's pretty handy too. So propane is safer to transport than gasoline, because propane that is transferred in tanks and carried on vehicles is actually put in DOT-rated cylinders as opposed to plastic red cans. So car accidents can happen with propane tanks, and you're still going to be in much safer shape than sloshing gasoline all over the inside of your car. So there's that. So the thing about propane, though, is it does reduce the rated output of your generator by about 20%. So it's not an equal amount of power to a gasoline-operated generator. It's the same exact generator, but because of the BTUs in the fuel, the ability for that fuel to create energy or convert energy into those watts, it reduces that power down by 20%. So why do you need to know that? If you're calculating the size of your generator to operate the watts and the power of whatever appliances that you want to operate in your home in a disaster, and you're going to go with propane, increase the size of the generator accordingly. It's not too complicated. I know it sounds like math and everything here, but what we're actually looking at is if I've got a 5,000 watt generator, so that's 5 kW, same thing as a 5,000 watt generator, and I'm going to run that on propane, I'm going to lose 20% of that wattage. If I needed all 5,000 of those watts, maybe I need to go up a size in the generator to accommodate for that. But that's not necessarily a bad thing, because propane fuel systems, they really never foul up. They don't have the carbons, they don't have the moistures, generally they don't have the corrosive problems that you'll get out of ethanol and regular gasoline. So fuel systems that run on propane are going to last for a very long time. I've had vehicles that run on propane that will go 1,000,000 miles, and because of the lack of all that oil that comes, through the gasoline and the moisture, those engines will last that much longer. So those are a little bit of the pros and cons between propane and gasoline. So let's talk about how much of that fuel to have on hand. So my recommendation, as somebody that's been in this field for a long time, is I would like to see 2 weeks of fuel based on your generator. And well, how do I figure that out? If you figure out what your run time is going to need to be based on the load of your appliances. So I can go on my refrigerator and I can see how much energy it takes. I can look, I'm going to run, if I'm going to run a water pump, or if I'm going to run fans or window shaker air conditioners, I can add all that up and I can say, okay, now I need this size of generator. That size, maybe let's use a 5 kW generator. That's a typical size generator you see down at the hardware store. Now I'm going to figure out, I'm going to run that with a strategy. Let's say I'm going to run that 10 hours overnight. At this load, my instructions on that generator are going to tell me what that fuel consumption is, and now I can calculate it. So I knew that when I was running a 5 kW generator, I was probably going to use 5 gallons per night, at the load that I was running last time I went through this. And now I know that if I want to run 2 weeks, I've got 7 nights at 5 gallons. So I'm looking at 35 times 2. I'm looking at 70 gallons of gas if I'm going to do that. So you start doing that math and you can figure out where you are. Now the minimum I would say to have generator backup fuel power is going to be 4 days. So that's what's going to happen with a lot of large propane tank systems. You start getting into the 15 kW, the 20 kW. I've seen 60 kW generators on large homes in the past, and they get this big tank on there and they run out of fuel in the first 2 days. So they're spending those tens of thousands of dollars to install that, and they are running out of fuel. You've got to think about the size of that generator that you're putting in. So when you're looking at that, plan accordingly. If you have to add a second underground tank, or you need to add more fuel, whether it be diesel or gasoline, account for that. I'd also recommend, while I'm thinking about adding some carbon monoxide detectors, that's carbon monoxide, which is the exhaust gas that comes out of an engine. That invisible odorless gas that can creep into your bedroom and help you not wake up in the morning. That's very important. So if you're going to use generators as a backup plan, even if that generator is close to the house, definitely do not run it in the garage. Some people have done that and they've not woke up the whole family because of that exhaust coming out. But I do think part of your emergency plans should be to have a carbon monoxide detector, at least in the sleeping areas, if not other areas where people are laying around during a disaster. So let's talk about that sizing and load capacity of a generator a little bit. Try not to make this too boring, too sciencey, but generators are rated on their energy output, and that is watts or kilowatts. A 5,000 watt generator is a 5 kW generator. Same thing, there's nothing fancy there. So 5 kW is just another way to say 5,000 watts. So don't be too confused when you see that. It could be 1 kW, 2 kW, or it could be 5 kW, it could be 60 kW. Those are just tens of thousands as you get into the larger sizes. Choose the smallest generator that you can get away with. And the reason for that, this is not the time to go big or go home, because you got to fuel that beast. We just talked about how much fuel it could take to run a 5 kW, 5,000 watt generator for a week or 2 weeks. If you're going to run it 24 hours a day, that could be a problem. If you're going to run it for, say, 10 hours a day, now you've reduced your fuel consumption, your needs, by less than half. So, half of what you would normally need. That's a big savings. Plus, it cuts down on your maintenance and everything else. If you get a generator that is oversized to put out the same power you need, it's still going to use more fuel. And that's not helpful when it comes to storing all that fuel. So always pick the smallest one you can get away with. Now, there's a thing called engine or motor startup, capacitor startup with some appliances, refrigerators, things with cooling capacitors and compressors in them. When they come on, you ever you seen the lights dim, or you see the motor go boom and it brings down the output on the generator? That's the startup. And then as that motor starts to spin, now that power kind of settles out. add that startup amperage off of that appliance into your load calculations. And that's pretty easy. Most generators will have a guide, and they'll say, I can run a refrigerator and 2 TVs or whatever it is. Use that information to your benefit. Print it off. Keep that with your generator stored for those emergencies so you can make those calculations when the internet is down. So don't try, in this case, don't try to run your full home central air conditioning system off of a generator. It's not gonna work. It's gonna take too much power. You're gonna have to oversize the generator. And as much as we love air conditioning, after a hurricane, after a disaster, when everybody is suffering off grid, that's not necessarily the time to try to cool down all the unused spaces in your house. What I would recommend is leave that off the circuits that you're going to use. And we're going to talk about circuits a little bit here coming up. Leave that off this system. Go down to the hardware store and pick up a box with a window shaker air conditioner. You don't need a giant one. You just need a small one. Remember, small AC, small generator, less fuel storage, more economical all the way around. Get the window shaker air conditioner, leave it in the garage on a shelf somewhere until you need it. When you need it, you put it in the window in the bedroom, like we talked about on the hurricane video. Put that in the window of the safe room or of the sleeping, cooling, resting room that we're going to establish after the grid is down. The whole family can go camp out in one room and sleep overnight with the AC on. While that AC is on, you're cooling down all the refrigerators and freezers again. Then in the morning, we're going to turn all of that off and get out and get to work. Leave the generator off during the day. So it's easier to cool things off at night when the air is naturally a little bit cooler and you're not using as much fuel by doing it that way. That's part of the strategy that's going to really help to extend your survival time on generators. Add up the watts of all your appliances to consider that startup load like we talked about. And remember that if you put too many things on one generator, you're going to bog the engine down on that generator, which is going to slow the generator spinning of the generating part of the generator, and it's going to send less energy to your refrigerator, for example. Electric motors don't like to be underpowered. So if I put too many things on a generator, and instead of putting out 110, 120 volts, somewhere in that range, and I'm only putting out 90 volts or something like that, that's going to damage the motors on all of my appliances. That's going to damage the refrigerator irreparably. It's going to damage TVs. It's going to damage electronics that are counting on a stable, what we call clean energy. We don't want our energy going up and down and up and down. That's why when we look for a generator, we look for one that is set up like an inverter, that's got stable power coming out. The older generators didn't have that. So when they started running, you hear them revving up and revving down, it was sending that unstable power to those appliances. And refrigerators and sensitive appliances like that we have these days with those logic boards on them don't like power that's surging at them. They just want a clean energy within the proper voltage range. So don't put too much on a generator, because then you're going to run at a consistent lower voltage and damage that appliance. So that's why it's nice to have a multimeter, a voltmeter on hand. You don't have to know all of the functions, but if you at least know what voltage, and you can test, just put the leads right into the outlet, without electrocuting yourself. You can take the little points, put them right into the outlet, and then you can check the voltage output. And if it's in that 110, 115, 120 range, then you're better off. But if you see that it's putting out 75 or 90 volts, that's bad. Or if it's putting out more than 120, 125, then that's bad too. You got to get in that right range. So have a voltmeter handy and keep that with its battery next to your generator for emergencies. Now, some people are on water wells. They're on wells with electric pumps on them. Now, electric pumps are often, for the best energy consumption, they are set up on a 220, 240 power line, right? So on their line coming in. You can do them on 110, but it's kind of hard on the pump, and it's kind of hard on the breaker a lot of times because they don't that surge when they come on. So do I recommend putting water wells on a generator? You can, but you've got to add that into the rest of the calculations of your generator. Now, generators can put out a 110, 120, but they can also have a 220 receptacle. They can have a 30 amp twist lock receptacle. There's some things you can learn about this. I'm not going to teach you everything today. I want you to learn what to ask. But you can do all of these things, but you just got to be careful when you put those loads on, especially what we consider an intermittent load. Like a water well pump won't run all the time. A refrigerator won't run all the time. So if you've got to calculate them as if they are running all the time, because if they both came on at the same time, what's that going to do to the power coming out of your generator? If they're alternating coming on and off, what's going to do with that surge? So read the directions on your generator, understand what you can put on there and wire it properly, and be very careful with that. So look at the that runtime strategy. So your generator is going to have the info on how long it will run based on what loads or how long you want to operate it, gallons per hour. I say again, and I'm going to reinforce it again and again, run your generator for about 10 hours overnight to refreeze your freezer. And to support that, before the power goes out, I would start putting water bottles in all of the empty voids inside of your refrigerator and in your freezer. Even if they're not frozen and you've been taking food out, fill them back up with water bottles that need to be frozen. And once they come up to that temperature, that will mitigate that up and down temperature cycle in that refrigerator and freezer coming on and off. If I'm going to leave the freezer off for 12 or 14 hours a day and leave that door closed, I want that stuff inside to stay frozen. And the more material I have in there that's frozen, the longer that food will keep without having active power on it. And you're going to have to judge this based on your situation, your generator output and so forth. So that's going to come in pretty handy to know that kind of thing and to mitigate that temperature warming. I would also say what happens, and I've experienced this, what happens when the neighbor has grandma on their side and they need her to have her medical equipment running and they want to borrow, can I just run my cord over and plug it into your generator? Would you mind? That'd be cool. Yeah, because grandma needs a fan all day. Okay, that's fine, but I'm not running my generator all day long. Yeah, but she really needs it. Can you run your generator longer? I'll contribute some fuel. Well, it's going to double your fuel intake to run that generator all the time. So you've got to make that decision. Are you going to allow that to happen? Are you going to make those arrangements? Whereas you had it all worked out in your head, I'm going to run it only at night, and now somebody wants me to run my generator all day. That changes my maintenance cycle, that changes my fuel needs, and what happens when they don't bring the fuel over like they say they're going to? Well, how long are you going to keep giving away your fuel? Now you've actually cut your survival time by 50% if you're going to run that thing twice as long as you had planned on. That's going to be a real problem for your family. So now you got another thing to think about. These are real situations that I've seen. Let's talk about extension cords a little bit. The sizing of extension cords is important. I can't run an entire house on a small, little 3-strand 12-gauge wire. I'm going to get that cord hot. It's going to melt. It's going to be a fire hazard. It's also it might continually trip out the breaker on the generator. And if I don't know that that's tripped, the generator is now just running, but it's not putting any power out. So I've got to get the right size cord, or I've got to use multiple cords in different parts of the receptacle to go to different places. That'll help balance some of that out. Some generators will have more than one set of receptacles on it. This is where your sizing is going to be so important. Now, because we're running a generator in a disaster environment that could be wet, flooding, a lot of water dripping, running around, and all these cords are on the ground, or they're running through the garage on wet concrete. And if one of those cords gets damaged and the insulation comes off of it, and you walk through that garage barefoot, or one of the kids come running out of the house, that concrete now is energized and you're going to look at getting electrocuted. So we don't want that. Look at the cords, make sure that they are in good shape, go down every inch of it and look for any slices or any problems with those cords. And then what I'd also recommend is putting a GFCI adapter. You can buy those separate from the extension cords at the hardware store. It plugs right into the generator and then you plug your cord into that. Anytime that thing senses some sort of a short, it will trip the GFI button on that and it'll shut the power off going to that cord. That's just like you have that receptacle next to your kitchen sink, your bathroom sink. That way, if somebody drops the hairdryer in the sink and the water gets on it, it pops that little button on the GFCI on the wall, on your house receptacle. That's the same premise that a portable GFI does, that it's got that little button on there in the GFI receptacle, which is called a ground fault circuit interrupter. So GFI and GFCI are the same thing, just a different way of saying it. Water on the ground and concrete, that's a big problem. So we got to talk about, like we did, puddles, if you're running cords through the yard, that's a problem. Vehicles running over the cords, damaging them, that can be a problem. So let's talk about some of these home remedies, DIY. It's no big deal. I'm gonna go down to Home Depot and I'm gonna pick up a bunch of electrical stuff and I'm gonna plug my generator and backfeed my house through the dryer receptacle. So my dryer is 240, 220. I can go ahead and just get a male plug on this side to go into the wall and backfeed power into the house. I can get my male receptacle that goes into the generator and plug it into the generator. So what I've got now is a live 220 plug with these prongs sticking out that's energized if that generator is running. That's a hazard. That's a serious danger. But if I plug my generator in there and I cross the wires inside that receptacle and I don't know what I'm doing, I'm now sending power backwards, reverse polarity through the house, and that's going to be a problem. And that's where you start blowing out TVs, blowing out refrigerators, blowing out the appliances when you really need them. So I strongly do not recommend creating your own cord that goes into the dryer onto the receptacle in your laundry room. If you're going to do that, and if you're not going to listen to my safety warning about that, you've got to make sure that you turn off every single breaker in your panel. You got to go to the panel before you plug it in. You got to turn off the main breaker and turn off every single breaker in the panel, and not just for that panel, but every panel in the house if you've got more than one. The reason for that is if I run power into the wall from my dryer, from my generator and say, aha, I made my own power, and you don't turn off that breaker, that electricity is going to go backwards through the breaker, backwards through your meter, and it's going to energize the power line going down the whole street. And anywhere that there's a wire that's on the ground, it's going to energize that wire. Or if there's a utility worker on a pole and he's trying to fix those wires and you energize that wire, it could catch him off guard and it could kill him on the pole. So you've got to be very careful not to energize power lines because you forgot to turn off all the breakers in your house. You can see why they created this thing called a transfer switch. So a transfer switch allows you to plug a generator into a box that's another circuit box that is properly wired into your home electric panel, your distribution panel. So then what happens is you turn off all the breakers and you only activate the special circuits that you're using that are considered your emergency circuits, and you're not backfeeding the street. So that's what I would recommend doing, is get a transfer switch properly installed by a qualified electrician so you're not injuring yourself or anybody else in the middle of a disaster. So that's a problem. So you could damage your appliances, you could get somebody killed, and that's not a good thing. Let's talk about securing your Ginny from theft. You may have heard me tell the story some time back where we had somebody that didn't buy their generator early enough. They waited to the last minute, they wanted power. They went out and bought a 7,500 watt, 7.5 kW generator, brand new, spent way too much money on it, and because they bought it when they needed it. And they set it up outside and they ran their cord into the house and they set it up outside their bedroom and they go to sleep. And they're hearing this thing running and it's nice, smooth hum. Oh, sounds good. My fan's running. I'm sleeping cool tonight. And then the guy's fan goes off. He's like, I don't know why my fan went off, but I still hear the generator running. So he gets up and he goes outside to check on his generator and say, well, did the plug come out or what happened? And he does not see his generator any longer. What he sees is an old crusty push mower that somebody had rolled up there, started up the gas engine, turned off the generator and rolled it away because it was on wheels. And now he lost it on the very first night, lost his beautiful new expensive generator and gained a crusty old lawnmower that is not going to provide power to his bedtime fan. So chain those things up, secure those things. Don't put them in the garage, don't run them there. But if you're going to operate them overnight, put them out of sight, out of mind, away from the street or where anybody else is going to get to them. And that leads me to the tactical considerations of noise and light discipline. Well, there's also a thing called sound discipline in tactics. If I can hear a generator, what am I going to say as a person who doesn't have any power that's in need of something? I'm going to hear a generator and say, but those people have a generator. That also means I can infer that they've got fuel. Well, I need some fuel. They might also have some food, and if I need food, they've got everything I need. Why don't I go knock on their door or borrow something without asking them? So you can reduce the sound signature of a generator by digging a pit If it's dry, you can dig a pit, you know, 1, 2, 3 foot deep, and then you can set your generator down inside of that. And then you can take some plywood, or you can make some walls, or sandbags, or whatever you want around that. And what that does is that takes the sound of your generator and sends it straight up into the air and not around the neighborhood. So where you think you hear a loud generator, you might actually only hear a low rumble or nothing at all, the further you get away from it. So that gives you a little bit more, it's another layer of security that you can use to reduce those stray cats that come around that want to borrow your stuff without asking. So moving on from that, the other thing I would say is pay attention to your maintenance. Understand that a typical 5 kW generator that you find down at Home Depot with a little Briggs & Stratton engine or something like that is going to have, for every 24 hours of actual runtime, it's going to need an oil change. So you need spare oil. Now, changing oil on a generator is not difficult. You just get it up on a table somewhere, you open up the little thing, you tip it over and pour it out into a, to a waste jug, and then you pour new oil in it, make sure you got the right amount, and start it back up again. If you don't change the oils on those things properly, and they're going to run and run and run, you can burn them up. Those generators made today are mostly disposable. Finding parts for them is not cost effective. I know that some generator, nicer ones, like I love Hondas. Hondas are more expensive, but to me, it always starts even after it's been sitting for a long time. I know that it's going to be a quality piece of equipment as opposed to one of the off-brand names. So if you were asking me, I would say Hondas. I'm going to do another generator video where I'm going to show off several types of generators, and we'll see how they sound. They're nice and quiet. I've got a 1,000 watt Honda that I can set on the table and run plenty of stuff and not even hear it. We can still have this conversation. So they're nice and quiet, so I like that about them. So have some spare oil for the proper size and type for that machinery. Have extra oil filters if yours calls for it. Extra little inline fuel filters, and all these little things just cost a few bucks a piece. But just get a little box of extra maintenance parts, just like you would for your car for long-term survival, and set those in the garage, tape that box shut, label it, maintenance supplies for my generator, and then follow those maintenance requirements. So that's what I've got for lessons learned from operating with generators. I hope you got something out of this. Check out for this and all kinds of other great information on Survival Dispatch Insider Magazine at insider.survivaldispatch.com. And until next time, this is Charlie. I'm out.